December 22nd, 2006, Broadway, New York City. The last Tower record store in America is closing. Outside, customers stand in the cold. Some press their hands against the glass. Some leave notes, handwritten, taped to the windows. Thank you for everything. This is where I became who I am. Inside, employees who have spent decades here fold the last shirts, box the last CDs, pull the last posters off the walls. Nobody is rushing. Nobody wants this to end. 7 years earlier, Tower Records was an empire. 200 stores, 27 countries, $1 billion in revenue every single year. Elton John showed up every Tuesday morning at 9 and bought a box of records. Bruce Springsteen browsed the aisles unannounced. The Sunset Boulevard flagship was a cathedral, not of religion, but of music. 7 years, that's all it took. Here's what everyone gets wrong. Napster didn't kill Tower Records. iTunes didn't kill Tower Records. The internet didn't kill Tower Records. Tower Records killed Tower Records with a single decision made in 1998, 2 years before anyone had ever heard of Napster. This is how an empire destroys itself from the inside. Sacramento, California, 1941. A 13-year-old boy is working the counter of his father's drugstore. The store sits at the base of the Tower Theater, a grand old movie house on Broadway, its vertical sign visible from 3 blocks away. The boy's name is Russell Solomon, and somewhere between filling prescriptions and sweeping floors, he discovers something that will define the rest of his life. Records. His father had started stocking them almost as an afterthought. A small rack near the back of the store, sandwiched between aspirin and shoe polish. But Russ noticed something. People didn't browse aspirin. People didn't linger over shoe polish. Records, though, records made people stop, made them lean in, made them stay. He filed that away. For the next decade, Russ Solomon watched, helped, and waited. He learned which artists moved and which collected dust. He learned that a customer who came in for 1 record would almost always leave with 2. He learned that music was not a product. It was a need as real and recurring as anything else his father sold. And he learned something else, something that would become the founding philosophy of everything he would build. If you carried everything, people would come from everywhere. In 1952, he tried to go out on his own, bought the record section from his father, attempted to expand. It failed. Distributors liquidated him. He was 27 years old and broke. Most people would have stopped there. Russ Solomon was not most people. By 1960, he was ready again. He opened a standalone record store on Watt Avenue in Sacramento. Same city, same stubborn belief, but this time with something he hadn't had before: clarity. The store would not try to be tasteful or curated or selective. It would carry everything, every genre, every label, every obscure import that nobody else bothered to stock. The sign outside was designed by a friend, bold, oversized lettering, visible from a distance. Loud on purpose. He named it Tower Records, after the theater where it all began. From the first week, the store had a different energy than anything else in Sacramento. The staff weren't salespeople. They were obsessives. They had opinions. They argued about albums. They handwrote notes on shelf cards explaining why a record mattered. Customers didn't just come to buy. They came to talk, to discover, to spend 2 hours in a store when they'd planned to spend 20 minutes. Russ didn't hire people who knew how to run a register. He hired people who knew music. That distinction would become Tower's greatest strength, and much later, part of its greatest weakness. Throughout the 1960s, Tower grew slowly, but with purpose. A second location, then a third. Then the move that changed everything, 1968, San Francisco. Russ had wanted a store in San Francisco since the beginning. He'd been born there. The city felt like home in a way Sacramento never quite did. He found the location on Columbus Avenue the morning after a long night out. Hungover, looking for breakfast, and there it was, a vacant building at the corner of Columbus and Bay, with parking. He signed the lease almost immediately. San Francisco validated everything. The store was packed from the moment it opened. The culture fit perfectly. The late 60s, the music scene, the sense that something was happening and Tower was right in the middle of it. Customers lined up for new releases, artists stopped by. The store became a gathering place in the truest sense of the word. Russ Solomon had proven something with Sacramento. San Francisco proved it wasn't an accident. But the real test, the one that would announce Tower Records to the world, was still coming. It was waiting on a boulevard in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, 1969. Tower Records opened its first Southern California location on the Sunset Strip, and nothing was ever quite the same again. The store sat on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood, and from the beginning it operated on a different scale than anything Tower had done before. This wasn't a neighborhood record shop. This was a destination. The aisles stretched on, organized by genre, by country, by label. A labyrinth of music that rewarded the patient and overwhelmed the uninitiated. The selection was staggering. If a record existed anywhere in the world, Tower either had it or could get it. That wasn't marketing. That was policy. In 1971, Tower outgrew its original Sunset location and built something new. A purpose-built flagship at the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Horn Avenue. Staff members helped construct it themselves. Managers swung hammers on weekends. There was a pride of ownership in that building that no corporate construction crew could have manufactured. When it opened, the store felt alive in a way that most retail spaces never do. Word spread fast in Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, word travels in a particular direction, straight to the entertainment industry. The stars came. Elton John established what became almost a religious ritual. Every Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, he walked through the doors of Tower Records on Sunset. He didn't send an assistant. He didn't call ahead. He came himself, worked through the new releases methodically, and left with a box, sometimes two. He later described it simply, "It was my music center." For one of the most famous musicians on the planet, Tower was not a convenience. It was a necessity. He wasn't alone. Bruce Springsteen browsed the aisles without announcement, flipping through records like any other customer. Mick Jagger, Jack Nicholson, Ella Fitzgerald. Brian Wilson famously showed up on more than one occasion in his bathrobe, as if the drive from his house to Sunset Boulevard didn't quite justify getting dressed. Nobody bothered them. That was part of the unspoken code at Tower. You were there for the music. So was everyone else. Whatever you were outside those doors stayed outside. This mix, icons and teenagers, critics and casual listeners, the famous and the anonymous, created something that no carefully designed retail experience could replicate. Tower on Sunset wasn't a store. It was a room where music made everyone equal. The late-night hours deepened that feeling. Tower stayed open until midnight, sometimes later around major releases. Tuesday midnight, when new albums officially dropped, drew crowds that spilled onto the sidewalk. People drove across the city for it. The ritual of buying a new record at midnight, driving home with it, putting it on, that experience lived at Tower. Nowhere else offered it at the same scale, with the same selection, with staff who could tell you exactly why that album mattered before you even got to the register. By the mid-1970s, Sunset Boulevard had become a pilgrimage site, and Russ Solomon was ready to take that energy to the rest of the world. The expansion that followed was unlike anything the music retail industry had seen. Tower moved methodically but ambitiously, always chasing the cities where music mattered most. San Francisco already belonged to them. Los Angeles was theirs. In 1983, they cracked New York City, opening on Broadway at the corner of 4th Street in the Greenwich Village. The New York store became its own kind of landmark, different from Sunset in texture and attitude, but identical in purpose. It was loud, dense, overwhelming in the best possible way. New Yorkers who were skeptical of everything embraced it immediately. Then came the move that would define Tower's global identity: Japan. Tower entered the Japanese market in 1979, opening in cities where American music had an almost mythological status among young people. The stores thrived immediately. Japanese customers brought a particular intensity to music collecting. Detail-oriented, completionist, loyal to artists in a way that translated directly into sales. Tower understood this market better than almost any other American retailer operating abroad. By the early 1990s, Japan was not just a successful satellite, it was one of Tower's most profitable operations. A third of all tower revenue by the late 1990s came from stores outside the United States. London followed, then Buenos Aires, then Seoul, Tel Aviv, Taipei, Kuala Lumpur. Tower published its own music magazine, Pulse, distributed inside stores, filled with reviews and interviews and the kind of deep catalog coverage that mainstream music press ignored. By 1995, Tower.com launched, making the company one of the first major retailers to establish an online presence. In 1999, at its absolute peak, Tower Records operated more than 150 stores in nearly 24 countries and generated $1 billion in annual revenue. $1 billion from a record store that started in a Sacramento drugstore because a teenager noticed people lingered over the record rack. Inside the stores, the culture that Russ had built in 1960 had somehow survived the scaling. Employees still wrote shelf cards by hand. Staff still argued about albums on the floor. The hiring philosophy hadn't changed. Find people who love music first, teach them everything else second. Jason Sumney, who started as a clerk at the New York store before moving into regional operations, would later say, "Never in my life before, and probably never again, will I experience anything like that. Every day was fun." That was the thing about Tower that numbers couldn't fully capture. The $1 billion was real. But what made the $1 billion possible was something harder to quantify. A genuine, infectious love of music that ran from the founder all the way down to the part-time clerk pulling the Tuesday night shift. Tower Records, at its peak, was not just the largest music retailer in the world. It was the closest thing the music industry had to a home. And in 1998, Russ Solomon decided it was time to make it even bigger. That decision would end everything. 1998, Tower Records is at the top of the world. $1 billion in annual revenue. Stores on 6 continents. A brand recognizable from Sacramento to Shibuya. The CD format had supercharged the entire music retail industry through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Consumers were rebuying their entire vinyl collections on compact disc, paying $15 to $20 per album. Margins were high, and the industry felt, to everyone inside it, genuinely invincible. But Russ Solomon was looking at a map, and the map still had empty spaces. The mood inside the music retail industry in 1998 was a specific kind of dangerous. The mood of people who have been right for so long that they've stopped seriously considering the possibility of being wrong. Tower wasn't alone in this. There were 10, 15 large chains all racing to become the dominant force in music retail. Musicland, Warehouse Music, Camelot Music. Every one of them was expanding, borrowing, chasing scale. The logic seemed airtight. More stores meant more revenue meant more leverage meant more stores. The cycle felt self-sustaining. Tower's leadership looked at this landscape and made a decision. They would borrow $110 million. The money came through a bond offering, a formal debt instrument, structured and deliberate, not a moment of impulse. Tower would use it to accelerate global expansion, to plant flags in markets they hadn't reached yet, to ensure that when the dust settled, Tower was the last music retailer standing. Ed Chrisman, who had been covering music retail for Billboard magazine for over 2 decades, watched it happen in real time. There was at least 10 or 15 large chains that were racing to be the dominant force in music. He would later say, Tower decided to take on $110 million in debt. It was just the mood of the day. Grow and go. Grow and go. 3 words that would eventually appear on Tower's tombstone. The problem wasn't the ambition. Tower had always been ambitious. The problem was the structure of the bet. A $110 million bond offering meant fixed obligations, interest payments that arrived on schedule regardless of how the business was performing. It meant that Tower's future was no longer entirely its own. It now belonged in part to the bondholders waiting for their returns. In the music retail industry of 1998, with CDs selling at peak margins and no visible disruption on the horizon, that felt manageable, comfortable even. What nobody in that boardroom fully accounted for was how fast the horizon could move. Inside Tower, not everyone was euphoric. Stan Goman had been with the company long enough to see patterns, long enough to know that the gap between confidence and recklessness was narrower than it looked from the top. For years, he had been pushing a different vision for Tower's future. Not global domination through sheer volume of new locations, but transformation of existing stores, converting high-overhead flagships into deeper, more specialized destinations. He tested the idea in Atlanta, turning a standard Tower location into something closer to the model pioneered by Amoeba Music. Used records alongside new, a store built for serious collectors as much as casual browsers. The results were immediate. Business went up roughly 20%. Goman brought the data to Russ. He had, by his own count, argument number 5250 about used record. He wanted to roll the model out broadly, convert stores in major cities, reduce overhead, build the kind of destination loyalty that no big box retailer could compete with. The conversation went nowhere. The expansion mindset had taken hold. And inside that mindset, the Atlanta experiment looked like a small idea. Tower wasn't in the business of getting smaller and smarter. Tower was in the business of getting bigger. Then the external pressure arrived, from a direction that had nothing to do with technology. Walmart, Best Buy, Target. Through the mid-1990s, these big box retailers had quietly moved into the CD business and immediately began selling music at prices Tower couldn't match. Their logic was simple and brutal. CDs were a traffic driver, not a profit center. They didn't need to make money on music. They needed music to bring customers through the door, so those customers would also buy televisions and refrigerators and everything else. They could price CDs at cost, or below cost, and still come out ahead. Tower couldn't do that. Tower was a music store. Music was all it had. Margins that had felt generous in 1992 were getting squeezed by 1996. By 1990, the pressure was real and measurable. And Tower's response was to borrow $110 million and open more stores, larger stores with higher rents and bigger staffs, in a market where the per-unit economics were already deteriorating. Goman would later reflect that the banks ultimately took over before his alternative vision could be implemented. The window to pivot had been open. Tower chose not to walk through it. By 1999, that window was about to be blown off its hinges entirely. A 20-year-old college dropout in Boston had just written a piece of software. He called it Napster. June 1999. A college student named Sean Fanning releases a piece of software from his dorm room at Northeastern University. It is called Napster. The premise is simple to the point of being almost laughable. A peer-to-peer file-sharing network that allows anyone with an internet connection to download any song from any artist at any time, completely free. No store, no register, no $15 CD with 14 songs you didn't want just to get the one you did. Just music, immediate and infinite, arriving on your hard drive in 3 minutes. Within 12 months, Napster has 80 million registered users. The music industry's response was fury. Lawsuits, congressional testimony, public campaigns comparing downloading to shoplifting. The labels were right that it was illegal. They were catastrophically wrong about what it meant. They treated Napster as a crime problem when it was actually a signal. The clearest possible signal that consumers wanted music delivered differently, and that whoever figured out how to do that, legally and conveniently, would own the next era of the industry. Nobody in the Tower boardroom was reading it that way. Russ Solomon, who had built his entire life around the belief that people needed to physically own music, to hold it, to shelve it, to display it, looked at Napster and saw a fad. Young people stealing music, a phase that would burn itself out once the courts shut it down. He had lived through 8 tracks, through the cassette scare of the 1980s when the industry ran home taping is killing music campaigns. Every format threat had ultimately driven more people into record stores, not fewer. He had no reason, from inside his own experience, to believe this would be different. He was wrong in a way that couldn't be undone. CD sales, which had grown virtually without interruption since the mid-1980s, began to fall in 2000. Not dramatically at first, a percentage point here, a few million units there, but the direction was unmistakable. And for a company carrying $110 million in debt with fixed interest obligations, even a modest revenue decline was not a modest problem. Tower's stores were built for a world where people bought physical music, large floor plates, prime retail locations, deep inventory, big staffs. Every element of the tower model was optimized for volume, and volume was starting to shrink. The timing could not have been worse, because Napster was only the opening act. February 2001. A federal appeals court orders Napster to stop allowing the sharing of copyrighted material. Within months, the service is effectively dead. The music industry celebrated. Tower exhaled. They shouldn't have. Napster's legal shutdown did not send people back to record stores. It sent them looking for the next Napster. Kazaa, LimeWire, Morpheus, a succession of peer-to-peer networks that were harder to kill precisely because they had no central server to shut down. The habit of free music had been established in 80 million households in less than 2 years. You cannot unteach a habit that convenient. And then, on October 23, 2001, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in Cupertino and held up a small, white rectangle. 1,000 songs in your pocket, he said. The iPod changed the physical relationship between people and music in a single product announcement. For the first time, your entire music library, not a selection, not a playlist, your entire library could come with you everywhere. The device was elegant, intuitive, and immediately desirable in a way that made every previous portable music player look like a prototype. 2 years later, in April 2003, Apple opened the iTunes Music Store. For the first time, there was a legal, convenient, and cheap alternative to both the record store and the piracy networks. 99 cents per song, no CD, no packaging, no trip across town. The album as a format, Tower's fundamental unit of commerce for 4 decades, was quietly being dismantled one song at a time. Tower Records lost $90 million in 2001 alone. $90 million in a single year, from a company already carrying $110 million in long-term debt. The math was becoming irreversible. Tower began closing underperforming locations, cutting staff, renegotiating leases. The billion-dollar revenue figure that had seemed so permanent in 1999 was evaporating faster than anyone had modeled. Simultaneously, the price-fixing scandal that had been building for years finally landed. In September 2002, Tower was among the retailers that settled with 41 U.S. states over minimum advertised price schemes, in which music distributors had paid retailers not to discount CDs. The settlement totaled $143 million industry-wide. Tower's share was $3 million, not devastating on its own, but one more weight on a structure already groaning under the load. Solomon, in interviews during this period, kept returning to the same belief. People would always want to own physical music. Collectibles, he called them. Objects with meaning. He wasn't entirely wrong about the sentiment. He was completely wrong about the scale. The bill was coming due, and Tower had nothing left to pay it with. February 2004. Tower Records files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The trigger was almost mundane in its specificity. A $5.2 million payment on the $110 million bond debt that Tower simply could not make. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The cash wasn't there. After years of declining CD sales, margin compression from big box competitors, the Napster fallout, and the slow bleed of iTunes eating into album purchases, one 99-cent song at a time, Tower had reached the point that every over-leveraged company eventually reaches. The moment when the gap between what you owe and what you have becomes impossible to bridge. The bankruptcy filing was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. What surprised people was the speed, how quickly a billion-dollar company had arrived at insolvency. 5 years. That's how long it took to go from the peak of the CD era to a federal courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware. 5 years from empire to Chapter 11. The restructuring that followed was painful and humiliating in equal measure. Tower's bondholders, the investors who had purchased that $110 million in debt back in 1998, agreed to forgive a significant portion of what they were owed. In exchange, they took 85% ownership of the company. Russ Solomon, who had built Tower Records from a Sacramento drugstore section over 4 decades, who had personally hammered nails into the Sunset Boulevard flagship, who had flown to Tokyo and London and Buenos Aires to open stores himself, Russ Solomon was left with 15% of the company he had created. 15%. He accepted it. He had no leverage to do otherwise. In the documentary All Things Must Pass, filmed a decade later, Solomon is direct about this period. I said to borrow all that damn money. I'm as guilty as anyone else. You make your mistakes and it catches up with you. You think you'll be all right, but when it catches up with you, it's too late to do anything about it. There is something almost unbearable about that admission. The clarity of hindsight from a man who had been, for most of his life, exceptionally good at seeing around corners. Tower emerged from Chapter 11 in August 2004, restructured and theoretically stabilized. The debt load had been reduced. The ownership had changed. The stores were still open. But the industry they operated in was not the same industry that had built them. The 2 years between Tower's first bankruptcy and its second were not a recovery. They were a controlled deterioration, a company doing everything right tactically while losing strategically because the strategy was no longer available. Management cut costs. They closed the weakest locations. They renegotiated supplier terms. They introduced scan and listen stations in stores in 2005, allowing customers to sample music before buying, a gesture toward the interactive experience that digital platforms were offering for free. They launched the Tower Insider Loyalty Program in 2006. Every initiative was reasonable. None of it addressed the fundamental problem, which was not operational but existential. The product Tower sold, in the format Tower sold it, at the price Tower needed to charge to cover its overhead, was losing to a competitor that charged nothing. By 2005, Tower's annual revenue had fallen from $1 billion to $430 million. In 2 years, cut in half. The stores that remained open were doing less business with higher fixed costs. Leases signed in the expansive late 90s, when Tower was flush and landlords knew it. The inventory model that had been Tower's greatest strength, carrying everything, stocking deep, never turning a customer away empty-handed, had become a liability. Warehouses full of CDs that consumers no longer wanted to pay for. Physical product in a world that was rapidly deciding it didn't need physical product. The other chains were falling around them. Musicland, which had operated Sam Goody and other retail music brands, had filed for bankruptcy in 2003. Warehouse music followed. The landscape was thinning, but not in a way that helped Tower. There was no market share to absorb because the market itself was contracting. Every store that closed represented customers who had not migrated to a competitor. They had migrated to iTunes, to LimeWire, to the hard drives of their laptops. Russ Solomon and his team spent 2005 and into 2006 searching for a solution that didn't exist. A way to make a large footprint, inventory-heavy, staff-intensive retail model work in an industry where the economics of physical music were collapsing in real time. They found nothing. In August 2006, Tower Records filed for bankruptcy for the second time. There would be no restructuring this time, no second chance, no third act. August 2006, Tower Records files for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Not Chapter 11, reorganization, restructuring, the possibility of emergence. Chapter 7, liquidation. The legal term for when a company has exhausted every option and the only remaining question is how to divide what's left among the people it owes money to. There would be no turnaround plan this time. No new ownership group riding in with fresh capital. No last-minute pivot to digital. The decision had been made in a federal bankruptcy court that Tower Records as an operating business was finished. The total debt outstanding was approximately $210 million. The assets, inventory, equipment, store fixtures, leases, the brand itself, would be sold to whoever bid highest. Everything Russ Solomon had spent 46 years building was about to be priced in auction. On October 6, 2006, the auction was held. A liquidation firm called Great American Group won with a bid of $134.3 million. The math was brutal and simple. $134.3 million coming in, $210 million going out. The creditors would recover roughly 60 cents on every dollar they were owed. The remainder, more than $70 million, simply disappeared. Gone. The accumulated consequence of the $110 million bet made in 1998, compounded by years of declining revenue, compounded by an industry that had changed faster than anyone had been willing to admit. The morning after the auction, Great American Group began the process of liquidation. Every tower record store in the United States, the remaining locations, after years of closures, still numbering in the dozens, would be emptied, closed, and handed back to their landlords. All inventory was to be sold at discount, all signage removed, all staff terminated. The announcement went out to employees across the country on the same day. People who had worked at Tower for 10, 15, 20 years learned via company communication that their jobs were gone. There was no transition period, no severance negotiation. The bankruptcy process had a schedule, and the schedule did not accommodate sentiment. The Russ Bus, as longtime employees had called the culture of Tower, the sense that working there was less a job than a membership in something, pulled over and stopped for the last time on a Tuesday morning in October, and everyone was told to get off. Inside the stores, though, the liquidation process had its own particular cruelty. Everything was marked down, first 10%, then 20%, then deeper as the weeks went on. And the customers who came to buy were the same customers who had kept the stores alive for decades. They were buying the inventory of a place they loved at a discount, which meant they were simultaneously mourning it and dismantling it. Staff watched their carefully curated sections, the import bins, the jazzback catalog, the staff picks they had agonized over, get picked apart and boxed up and carried out the door. The yellow and red signs came down last. Those signs, oversized, primary colored, visible from a block away, had been a landmark in every city where Tower had operated. They had announced something. Music lives here, and it lives loudly. Taking them down was not a logistical task. It was an erasure. In Los Angeles, a small group of fans gathered outside the Sunset Boulevard flagship on the day the sign came down and watched in silence. Some of them had been coming to that store since the 1970s. They had bought their first albums there. They had met their friends there. They had spent Tuesday midnights there waiting for records that mattered. They watched the sign come down, then they went home. The closures spread across the country through November and into December, store by store, city by city, like lights going out on a map. Washington, D.C., the Foggy Bottom store, open for 24 years, closed on December 22nd. Atlanta closed the same day. The Alexandria, Virginia location closed on December 18th. The Tyson's Corner store followed 3 days later. In each city, the pattern was the same. A final week of deep discounts, a thinning of the shelves, a last shift for employees who in many cases had nowhere else to go in an industry that was disappearing around them. In Los Angeles, the Sunset Boulevard flagship, the store that had defined Tower more than any other location, the store where Elton John had kept his Tuesday morning ritual for decades, where Brian Wilson had shopped in his bathrobe, where the sign had burned bright red and yellow against the California sky since 1971, closed its doors for the last time in the final days of December. No ceremony, no formal goodbye. The inventory was gone. The shelves were bare. The staff who had spent years there turned off the lights and locked the door and walked out onto Sunset Boulevard for the last time. New York went last. The Broadway store, 4 stories, Greenwich Village, open since 1983, had become in its final week something between a record store and a memorial. Customers came not just to buy, but to be there one more time, to walk the aisles that had been part of their lives for 20, 25 years. They brought markers and post-it notes and taped messages to the windows facing Broadway. The notes accumulated over days, hundreds of them, overlapping, some funny, some devastated, some simply a name and a year. 1987-2006, thank you. The staff left them up. On the evening of December 22, 2006, the last customers were rung up at the Broadway register. The remaining inventory, whatever hadn't sold through weeks of liquidation, was counted and cataloged for the final time. The registers were closed. The floor was empty. Employees who had opened that store in the morning of its last day gathered briefly, without fanfare, and then dispersed into the New York night. The date was not accidental. December 22, 1966, 40 years earlier, almost to the day, Russ Solomon had opened his first Tower record store in Sacramento. He had been 41 years old. He had borrowed money from friends and relatives. His cousin had done the electrical work. His father had given him his start. He had built, from that foundation, the largest music retail chain the world had ever seen. 40 years later, to the week, it was over. Russ Solomon sent a final email to his staff that evening. It was characteristically unadorned. No corporate language, no careful messaging, no attempt to frame the ending as anything other than what it was. He wrote, "The fat lady has sung, she was off-key. Thank you, thank you, thank you." 6 words of defeat, 6 words of acknowledgement, 9 words of gratitude. It was, in its way, entirely him. There is a particular silence that settles over a place that used to be full of music. Not the silence of a library or a church. Those silences have intention behind them. The silence of an empty Tower record store was different. It was the silence of absence, of something that had been loud and alive and present, now simply gone. The shelves that had held millions of records over 40 years, the listening stations, the handwritten shelf cards, the yellow and red walls, the smell of plastic and cardboard and new releases on a Tuesday morning. All of it gone. Outside, New York kept moving, the way New York always does, indifferent to individual endings. Broadway was loud and bright and full of people who had somewhere to be. Inside, the lights were off. Tower Records was finished, but the consequences, for the people who had built it, for the city blocks it had occupied, for the industry it had helped define, were only beginning. When the lights went out at Tower Records, they went out on thousands of individual lives simultaneously. Not metaphorically, literally. On December 22, 2006, every remaining Tower employee in the United States lost their job on the same day. People who had spent decades inside those stores, who had built their identities, their friendships, their entire professional lives around a place that no longer existed, walked out into an industry that had no use for what they knew how to do. Consider what a Tower Records career actually looked like for a long-term employee. You were hired because you loved music, not because you had a retail background or a business degree, but because you could talk for 45 minutes about the difference between 2 pressings of the same album and make a customer feel like that conversation was the most important thing that had happened to them all week. You learned the store from the floor up. You built relationships with customers who came back every Tuesday, every month, every year. You became, in the truest sense, a curator, someone whose taste and knowledge shaped what other people listened to, discovered, and loved. That skill set had no direct translation in December 2006. The music retail industry was not contracting. It was collapsing. Sam Goody was gone. Warehouse was gone. Musicland was gone. The independent stores that survived did so by being small and specialized, and they weren't hiring because they couldn't afford to. The major labels were laying off their own staff. The entire ecosystem that had employed tens of thousands of people who loved music for a living was dismantling itself in real time, and there was no adjacent industry waiting to absorb them. Some found their way into music supervision, into streaming platforms, into the early years of digital music curation. Some opened their own small stores, deeply personal, intensely local, built on the model that Tower had pioneered, but at a fraction of the scale. Some left the music industry entirely, carrying with them a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. The grief of losing not just a job, but a vocation, a community, and a way of understanding yourself in the world. They had given Tower their best years. Tower had given them everything it could until it couldn't anymore, and then it was simply gone. For the customers, the millions of people who had built rituals around Tower Records over 4 decades, the loss registered differently, not as unemployment or financial crisis, but as the removal of something they hadn't known they depended on until it wasn't there. Tower had been, for an entire generation of music listeners, the place where identity was formed. You didn't just buy records at Tower. You discovered who you were through what you bought, what you browsed, what you overheard a staff member arguing about in the jazz section on a Wednesday afternoon. Actor Colin Hanks, who would spend 7 years making a documentary about Tower called All Things Must Pass, described it this way: Tower helped pave the way for your identity. Music makes people sometimes. You latch onto it as a way of identifying yourself, your tribe. And you got that at Tower Records. That was not something iTunes could replicate. Not because iTunes was inferior as a delivery mechanism. It was in almost every practical sense superior. But a delivery mechanism is not a place. And Tower had always been, first and last, a place. The founder felt the loss as sharply as anyone. Russ Solomon spent the years after 2006 trying, in various ways, to find a second act. In 2007, he opened a new record store in Sacramento, a small personal shop called R5 Records, named after a local bus route. It was in some ways a return to the beginning. Sacramento Records, a store built by hand with people who love music. But the market had moved beyond the point where even the most devoted effort could overcome it. R5 Records closed in 2010. A rival shop, Dimple Records, took over the location and threw Solomon a retirement party. He spent his final years as an elder statesman of an industry that no longer existed in the form he had known it. He gave interviews. He participated in Hanks's documentary with characteristic bluntness and humor. He never stopped believing that physical music mattered, that the object had a value the digital file could not replace. On March 4, 2018, Russ Solomon sat down to watch the Academy Awards with his wife. At some point during the broadcast, he asked her to refill his whiskey glass. She turned around and he was gone. He was 92 years old. While the last American tower was going dark, 12 time zones away the lights were still on. Shibuya, Tokyo. December 2006. The Tower Records store on Shibuya's main shopping strip, 9 floors, tens of thousands of titles, one of the largest music retail destinations on the planet, was open for business. Not limping, not liquidating. Open, stocked, staffed, and profitable. Customers moved through the floors with the same focused intensity that Tower customers everywhere had once brought to the aisles. They examined liner notes. They listened at sampling stations. They bought CDs, full-price, physical CDs, without hesitation. In Japan, the music retail apocalypse that had consumed Tower's American operations had simply not arrived on the same timeline. Japanese consumers maintained a relationship with physical media that had no real equivalent in the United States. A cultural attachment to the object itself, to the packaging, the artwork, the liner notes, the experience of ownership in its most literal form. Streaming and digital downloads existed in Japan, but they had not displaced physical music the way they had in America. The CD was not a relic in Tokyo. It was still the primary format. Tower Records Japan had seen this coming. Not the American collapse, but its own separation from it. In October 2002, 4 years before the U.S. bankruptcy, Tower Records Japan completed a management buyout and became a fully independent company. The timing was deliberate. Japanese management had watched the American operation straining under its debt load, had watched the CD market beginning to soften in the U.S., and had made a calculated decision to sever the corporate relationship before the American problems became their problems. When Tower Records filed for Chapter 7 in the United States in 2006, Tower Records Japan was entirely unaffected. Different company, different ownership, different balance sheet. The independence saved everything. Tower Records Japan not only survived, it grew. By the time its American parent had been auctioned off to a liquidation firm for $134 million, the Japanese operation was expanding into new locations, investing in its stores, and deepening the very model that Tower had pioneered in Sacramento in 1960. Carry everything, hire people who love music, make the store a destination rather than a transaction. As of 2015, NTT Docomo and Seven & I Holdings, 2 of Japan's largest corporations, had become the primary stakeholders. Tower Records Japan had, in effect, become a pillar of Japanese retail culture. The contrast was almost impossible to reconcile. One brand, 2 completely different fates, the same yellow and red signs, the same founding philosophy, the same name. And on one side of the Pacific, liquidation, on the other, expansion. What it illustrated was not simply that Japan was different from America, though it was. What it illustrated was that Tower's model was not inherently broken. It was broken in a specific context. The American market, where digital disruption hit hardest and fastest, and where a company carrying $110 million in debt had no cushion to absorb the impact. Remove the debt. Remove the American market dynamics. Keep the philosophy. And Tower worked. It still works. In Tokyo right now, a Tower record store is open. Someone is flipping through the import section on the fourth floor. Someone is reading a handwritten shelf card. Someone is buying a CD they will take home and listen to beginning to end. The way music was designed to be heard. In America, that world is gone. In Japan, it never left. Back in the United States, Tower's story did not end entirely in 2006. But what came after was something different. Smaller, quieter, and shaped by absence rather than presence. The brand was not finished, but the era it represented was. Every empire that falls leaves behind a question, not the obvious question, not what happened, because what happened is always visible in hindsight, clean and sequential and almost inevitable looking from the far side of the wreckage. The real question is harder. It is, what could have been different? And underneath that, harder still, does the answer matter, or was the outcome inevitable regardless? Tower Records invites both questions, and it answers them in ways that extend far beyond the music industry. The first lesson is the one that Tower's own people identified most clearly and most painfully in the years after the collapse. The debt killed Tower before the disruption did. This is not a subtle distinction. It is the central fact of the entire story. In 1998, when Tower borrowed $110 million to finance global expansion, Napster did not exist. iTunes did not exist. The iPod did not exist. The digital music revolution that would ultimately destroy the physical music retail industry was, at that moment, 2 to 3 years away from its first visible form and 5 years away from its commercially decisive form. A Tower Records with no long-term debt in 1999, when Napster launched and CD sales began to soften, would have had options. It could have closed underperforming locations without triggering a credit crisis. It could have reduced its cost structure gradually rather than desperately. It could have experimented with the used record model that Stan Goman had proven worked, converting stores into the kind of deep catalog destinations that serious collectors would pay for even in a digital world. It could have pivoted, slowly and imperfectly, towards something viable. None of those options were available to a company with $110 million in fixed obligations and a revenue line falling at the rate Tower's was falling. The debt didn't just limit Tower's options, it eliminated them. By the time the scale of the digital disruption became undeniable, Tower had no room to maneuver. Every dollar of revenue decline translated directly into a dollar of crisis, because there was no margin, no cushion, no runway. The $110 million bet, made in a moment of industry-wide euphoria, had turned Tower's future into a hostage. The second lesson is about scale, specifically the point at which an organization's greatest strength becomes its greatest vulnerability. Tower's competitive advantage had always been size and depth. Carry everything, stock every import, every back catalog title, every obscure label release that no other store bothered with. That philosophy built the billion-dollar business. But it also built a cost structure, large floor plates, prime locations, with enormous inventory commitments, large staffs of knowledgeable employees that required a specific minimum level of revenue to sustain. When the revenue fell below that minimum, there was no lighter version of Tower to retreat to. The model was indivisible. You couldn't run a smaller tower and preserve what made Tower Tower. The cathedral required the congregation. The third lesson is the one that sits hardest, because it involves something Tower genuinely had that almost no company ever achieves. Tower had culture, real culture, not the corporate kind, articulated in mission statements and employee handbooks, but the kind that emerges organically from people who love what they do, working alongside other people who love what they do. The staff cards written by hand, the Tuesday midnight rituals, the employees who stayed for 20 years not because the pay was exceptional, but because there was nowhere else on earth they would rather be. Customers who drove across cities, not because Tower was the most convenient option, but because it was the only place that felt like home. That culture was not enough to save the business, but it explains why the business mattered, why fans left notes on the windows of a closing record store, why grown adults wept in a documentary about a retail chain, why a teenager in Sacramento decided that a room full of records was worth building his entire life around. The sign on the wall of every Tower record store read, "No music, no life." They were right about the music. They were wrong about the debt. And in the end, the debt was louder. What Tower built was real. What Tower lost was real. And what disappeared with it, the particular experience of discovering music in a room curated by people who loved it as much as you did, has not been replaced. Not by streaming algorithms, not by curated playlists, not by anything. Some things, when they go, leave a shape behind them, an outline of absence, a silence that has texture. Tower Records left that kind of silence. And anyone who ever stood in one of those stores on a Tuesday morning with a new record in their hands and nowhere else they needed to be, they can still feel it.